When June Lockhart died on October 23, 2025, at the age of 100, she was the last surviving adult star of Lost in Space. In her final interviews, she spoke with a candor she'd never allowed herself before, and her passing closed a chapter on one of the strangest, most quietly turbulent productions in American television history. By 2025, only 3 original members of the Robinson family were still alive: Bill Mumy, Will Robinson, who turned 72, Angela Cartwright, Penny Robinson, 73, and Marta Kristen, Judy Robinson, 81. June Lockhart, who played Mother Maureen Robinson, had outlived them all in terms of screen seniority, dying peacefully in Santa Monica. In her last conversations with interviewers, Lockhart finally described how she learned the show had been cancelled, not through a phone call, not through a producer's thank you, but by reading a brief item in the entertainment section of her morning newspaper. That was the entirety of the send-off. CBS gave a cast that had carried one of the most-watched science fiction series of its era for 3 years. She wasn't alone in that wound. Bill Mumy, only 14 when the show ended, has said in later interviews that he cried when his agent called with the news. He'd spent the final season believing a 4th was already locked in. Then the network's renewal list came out. The Jupiter 2 wasn't on it, and a 14-year-old who'd spent his entire adolescence on that soundstage went home and wept. By the time these later, more honest interviews surfaced, most of the cast was already gone. Mark Goddard, Don West, died of pulmonary fibrosis on October 10, 2023, at 87. Jonathan Harris, Dr. Smith, died November 3, 2002. Bob May, who wore the robot suit for 3 seasons, died in January 2009. Dick Tufeld, the robot's voice, followed in January 2012. And yet the 3 remaining Robinson children keep finding each other. On March 17, 2026, Bill Mumy posted a photo of himself with Cartwright and Kristen, captioned Judy, Penny, and Will Robinson, spotted on Oath yesterday. 60 years after the show first aired, that loyalty says something the foam rubber aliens and painted plywood sets never could. Before he was Dr. Smith, Jonathan Harris was born into a modest Bronx tenement family, the son of a garment district worker and Russian immigrants. He reinvented himself almost from scratch, changing his surname from Charasuchin to Harris at 17, against his father's objections, earning a pharmacy degree he never used, and building an acting resume through sheer will. By the time Irwin Allen cast him in Lost in Space, Harris had already worked Broadway, The Twilight Zone, and well over 100 stage productions. The role, as originally written, was a trap. Dr. Smith was a cold-blooded saboteur who killed a guard in the pilot and reprogrammed the robot to murder the Robinsons in their sleep, a character built to be despised and written out within 5 episodes. Harris saw exactly what that meant for his career and started quietly rewriting the part. He'd show up with pages of new dialogue drafted overnight, telling castmates he'd changed everything. Bill Mumy, a child of the time, watched Harris steer nearly every scene back towards Smith, the cowardly eye rolls, the theatrical complaints about his back, and a growing list of invented insults for the robot: bubble-headed booby, nickel-plated nincompoop, bellicose bumpkin. Harris framed it as character logic. The robot suspected Smith's schemes, so Smith had to keep undermining it to survive. It worked. Within a season, Dr. Smith was pulling in roughly 500 fan letters a month, and Irwin Allen had no real choice but to embrace it. Allen later admitted publicly that Smith hadn't been designed as comic relief. Harris had simply taken control of the character. Harris negotiated a special guest star credit on all 83 episodes, reportedly a first for American television. But his triumph came at someone else's expense. Guy Williams arrived on Lost in Space already famous, having spent 4 years as Disney's Zorro, a role that had generated an estimated $11 million in merchandising within months of the show's debut. Fencing trained since age 7, Williams was meant to anchor the series as Professor John Robinson, the family's commanding presence. Instead, his screen time eroded season by season as the Dr. Smith storylines expanded to fill the space. By the 3rd season, Williams was mostly standing in the background while Harris, Mumy, and the robot carried each episode. Mark Goddard later said plainly that the show tilted increasingly towards Smith and the robot, and that there were real hard feelings from Williams about it. Even Harris, the cause of it, acknowledged how brutal it must have been for a man hired to lead the series to end up with an occasional line every other week. Williams filled his idle hours on set with classical music, astronomy books, chess, and stock trading. Mummy nicknamed him the Comb for his habit of constantly grooming himself between takes. In one account, Williams snapped to Harris, "Goddamn, I'll kill you, Harris," before catching himself, "I mean Smith." True or embellished, it captured the tension precisely. After cancellation, Williams found his American career hadn't survived years of being background scenery on his own series. But in Argentina, Zorro had become a genuine cultural touchstone. The government gave him a marina apartment, and he was personally invited to a charity event by the wife of President Perón. He spent the final 21 years of his life living, in effect, as royalty in a country that had never forgotten him. On May 6, 1989, police entered his Buenos Aires apartment after friends reported him missing and found he died alone of a ruptured brain aneurysm roughly a week earlier. He was 65, and in an era before mobile phones, no one had noticed. Bill Mummy later said simply that once the show ended, he never saw Guy again. Every kid who watched Lost in Space in the 1960s loved the robot, the waving accordion arms, the barked warnings, the odd warmth radiating from a machine of metal and rubber. For 3 years, the man inside that suit endured conditions the production treated as someone else's problem. Bob May stumbled into the audition almost by accident while applying for a different job at 20th Century Fox. The triad was blunt. If the suit fit, he had the part. When he first climbed out after a session inside it, he was cut and bleeding from its metal edges. And he took the job anyway. The costume weighed close to 200 pounds and, under studio lighting, turned into what May later called his own jacuzzi and sauna combined. It was nearly airtight. On at least 2 occasions across the show's run, he passed out from lack of oxygen, his eyes rolling back before crew realized something was wrong. The production's response, by his own account, was that there wasn't time to stop filming. May smoked between takes inside the suit, and June Lockhart recalled watching smoke drift out through its seams, which he found quietly funny. As the story goes, Irwin Allen once spotted smoke rising from the apparently empty robot and panicked, thinking it was on fire, and after learning it was just May's cigarette, reportedly decided that whenever a script called for the robot to smoke, May should generate it himself. Despite performing nearly every gesture that made the robot beloved, May was never credited on screen across the entire original run, which meant lower pay and reduced residuals as the show grew into a global franchise. By the time it was earning steady licensing income decades later, May and his wife Judith were living in a mobile home park in the San Fernando Valley. The 2008 sci-fi destroyed their home, and 2 months later May died of congestive heart failure at 69. What defined his later years wasn't bitterness but generosity. He became a fixture on the convention circuit, staying at signing tables until the last fan was satisfied or venue staff made him leave. Before any of this, before the robot, before Dr. Smith, before a single foam alien, Irwin Allen made a 60-minute pilot called No Place to Hide, filmed in late 1964 on a roughly $600,000 budget, the most expensive TV pilot of its time. The team behind it included an Oscar-winning cinematographer, a future Oscar-winning effects supervisor, and a writer who later worked on Star Trek. It was a straightforward, serious survival story. The Robinsons, both parents holding doctorates, knocked off course and stranded on an alien world, with no villain, no comedy, and no robot. CBS executives loved it and bought the series on the spot, then handed Allen a list of changes. They wanted a recurring antagonist and a robot to sustain weekly conflict. Ming the Merciless was floated, then something closer to Long John Silver, and the two settled on Dr. Zachary Smith. About 80% of the original series footage was later spliced into the first 5 episodes of Season 1, with Smith and the robot written as having stayed behind on the ship to explain their absence from scenes filmed before either character existed. The show premiered September 15, 1965. Its Jupiter 2 interior set cost roughly $350,000, more than the Star Trek Enterprise bridge, and its theme was composed by a 24-year-old named Johnny Williams, who would later become John Williams, composer of Star Wars, Jaws, and Indiana Jones. Despite its reputation today, Star Trek never outrated Lost in Space during its original run. Lost in Space typically landed in the low to mid-30s in the Nielsen rankings, while Star Trek rarely cracked the top 50. The rivalry began before either aired, When Gene Roddenberry pitched Star Trek to CBS, the network was already developing Lost in Space and Past, sending Roddenberry to NBC instead. One of the odder episodes of the rivalry came when the Lost in Space makeup team, short on time and budget for an alien character, borrowed the actual ear molds used for Spock and repaint.